Hello, welcome to another scary story that you can fall asleep to. Lena Holm, a former cryptographer turned freelance atmospheric physicist, arrived at the desolate research outpost near Blackwood Creek, Maine. She was responding to an urgent, encrypted distress call from her mentor, Dr. Elias Thorne, regarding an anomaly in the extremely low frequency ELF spectrum. The post was eerily silent. Thorne's equipment, a proprietary array of VLF receivers, was still powered, but the data feed had flatlined precisely 48 hours ago. The only unusual observation was the ambient sound, a profound sonic cancellation, a silence so absolute it pressed against the eardrums. In the main lab, Lena found Thorne. He was sitting upright at his console, dead. His eyes were wide open and completely white, burned by something invisible, yet clearly seen. Tucked beneath his rigid fingers was a single, cryptic note scrawled on a graph paper. The listener demands symmetry. End the cycle. Lena noticed a small, faint, perfectly drawn asterisk etched into the wooden desk beside his hand. A repeating symbol with 8 razor, straight lines radiating from a central point. It was a pattern of absolute order, deeply unsettling against the chaos of the lab. She started downloading Thorne's last raw data packet, terrified by the implications of the note and the geometric symbol. This was not a power surge or a heart attack. It was an act of geometric will. The silence was the inertial medium for something vast, and she had just broken its pattern by arriving. Thorne's final data packet was enormous, containing months of seemingly random alpha-velf background noise. Lena used her specialized spectral analysis software to sift through the static. Hours later, she found it. Hidden beneath the noise floor was an ultra-low frequency carrier wave, faint but undeniably artificial. It was a pulsed signal operating in the 3 to 30 cos range, right at the boundary between VLF and ELF. The VLF whisper. The frequency was not constant. It oscillated between 2 fixed points with perfect mathematical precision. It was too regular, too structured to be natural. The oscillation pattern, when graphed, resolved into a complex rotating fractal, the same pattern as the 8 lashed asterisk she found on Thorne's desk. This confirmed the geometric nature of the entity Thorne called the listener. It was communicating through geometry, using the VLF spectrum as its medium. She analyzed the amplitude modulation. It wasn't T carrying data, but tone, a single, agonizingly pure tone that seemed to vibrate the molecular structure of the air, responsible for the area. Sonic cancellation. Lena theorized the tone was acting as a geometric schematic, an auditory blueprint. The listener was imposing on the physical world. The note, "The listener demands symmetry," suddenly made sense. The entity was trying to achieve perfect geometric order. Thorne's death was the result of seeing too much of the blueprint. Lena had now seen the spectral representation of the asterisk. She felt a cold pinprick behind her own eye. The 8 lashed asterisk wasn't T merely a symbol. It was a key. Lena discovered its full expression in Thorne's encrypted hard drive, nested within CAD files disguised as geological surveys. It was a non-Euclidean geometric blueprint, detailed and terrifying, referred to internally as the Grand Confirmation Schema. The asterisk was the core, radiating outward in fractal spirals, that, if fully realized, would tile the entire local reality with perfect, unnatural symmetry. Lena realized the sonic cancellation was a byproduct of the listener, using the local environment as its inertial medium, suppressing all random noise, chaos, to better impose its rigid, ordered geometry. The local geology, a large, dense granite deposit, was acting as a resonating chamber for the VLF whisper. Thorne's notes mentioned a colleague, Daniel Kerr, a brilliant but disgraced theoretical mathematician who had warned Thorne about the observer mechanism. Kerr had believed the listener required a human observer to consciously confirm its existence, thus translating its abstract geometry into physical reality. The observer was the final bridge. Thorne had been the observer, and his death was the result of a catastrophic feedback loop, the ultimate confirmation. Lena, having seen the schematic, was now next in line. She needed to find Kerr, or at least his work, before the listener completed its grand confirmation schema. She printed out the schematic, a dense, beautiful, and utterly lethal diagram, and packed what little she had, abandoning the outpost to the chilling silence. Lena's search for Daniel Kerr led her to the archives of the abandoned Project Cassandra, the obscure military research initiative Thorne and Kerr had worked for in the early 1990s. Project Cassandra was dedicated to VLF communication with submerged assets, but its true, secret objective was the analysis of non-biological, structured electromagnetic signals. Kerr had been purged from the project following an incident involving unauthorized geometric experimentation and the subsequent institutionalization of another colleague, Dr. Shaw. Lena tracked Kerr's last known address to an old apartment complex in a forgotten corner of rural Massachusetts. The apartment was stripped bare, but the walls were covered in frantic scrawls. Kerr hadn't used paint or charcoal. He had used acid, carving equations directly into the plaster and concrete. Lena photographed every segment, compiling a chilling record of a mind battling cosmic order. The equations were a jumble of chaotic differentials, seemingly designed to negate symmetry. One recurring phrase was key: the counter formula. Kerr was working on a way to fight the listener, but the most significant find was in the floorboards, a small lead-lined safe containing a single, waterproof journal. The journal was bound in black leather, its pages filled with neat handwriting, then descending into furious, desperate script, detailing his attempts to build a cancellation field. The last entry was dated 3 years ago. Kerr had gone silent, but his work remained. Lena now held the conceptual outline of the weapon against the listener's geometry. Daniel Kerr's journal detailed his final project, a localized, inverted VLF broadcast designed to create a region of absolute geometric cancellation, a pocket of pure, enforced chaos that the listener could not penetrate or resolve. He called it the zero space. The journal explained that the Blackwood Creek VLF signal wasn't just a tone. It was an active computational process requiring continuous confirmation to maintain its geometric structure. By introducing a precisely tailored chaotic signal, Kerr aimed to overload the listener's computational capacity, trapping it in a feedback loop of unresolvable entropy. Kerr had managed to construct a prototype cancellation field, a physical loop antenna array installed deep beneath the granite of Blackwood Creek. This explained the unnatural silence at the outpost. It was the zone of cancellation. The journal noted, however, that the field was incredibly fragile, requiring constant manual maintenance to prevent its collapse. The last entry ended with a warning: the listener is adapting. It requires a new observer. If the field fails, the geometry will spread instantly and globally. The counter must be a non-verbal act of self-denial. The field had failed. Thorne was dead, and the geometry was free. Lena realized the profound silence she first encountered was not natural. It was the final, agonizing breath of care, feel. She now carried the listener, S key, the asterisk schematic, and the only blueprint for its negation, the counter formula. As Lena drove, poring over Kerr schematics for the counter formula, the subtle pinprick behind her eye from Chapter 2 became a cold, surgical sensation. She stopped the car to examine it in the rearview mirror. In her left iris, precisely where the reflective light caught it, was a minute almost invisible scar. The 8 lashed asterisk, exactly matching the geometry of the VLF whisper and the schematic. It wasn't T-pigment, it was a physical change in the tissue. She was the new observer. The listener had successfully bridged the gap from abstract geometric signal to physical neurological imprint. The scar was the physical manifestation of the observer. S-link, allowing the listener to use her conscious mind as its final processor, a cognitive link between abstract geometry and the physical world. She understood Kerr's desperate note. She had to fight the entity inside her. The counter formula, therefore, could not be a simple broadcast. It had to be a cognitive weapon designed to destroy the listener's ability to process order, starting with the observer's mind. The entity now saw what she saw and knew what she thought. Anticipating her every move, Lena tried to write down a crucial variable of the counter formula, a coefficient for organized chaos. But as her pen touched the paper, the scar burned, and she was hit by a wave of crippling nausea. The listener was policing her thoughts, denying her the ability to linguistically formalize the anti-pattern. She had to internalize the fight. Lena needed external data to complete the counter formula without relying on her corrupted internal thoughts. She drove to a nearby state hospital where she tracked down Dr. Agnes Shaw, the colleague Kerr had institutionalized years ago. Shaw was the key, the original confirmer who failed. Shaw was catatonic, sitting in a sterile white room, perpetually drawing the 8, lashed asterisk on her palm with an imaginary pen. Lena used a portable VLF receiver near Shaw. The ambient noise was louder here. The VLF whisper slightly distorted, indicating Shaw's presence created a local pocket of geometric instability. Lena placed a set of noise canceling headphones over Shaw's ears and played a loop of highly complex, non-repeating acoustic noise. Pure entropy. Shaw reacted instantly, her eyes flashing wide open, a torrent of frantic, non-contextual phrases spilling out. The angles shift. The number is 7, not 8. The mirror is broken. Lena recorded the words, realizing this was not madness, but a stream of cognitive residue, the shattered thoughts of a mind that had failed to confirm the listener. She focused the audio analysis on the tone of Shaw's voice, searching for a pattern in the noise. She found it, a subtle, high-frequency tonal distortion in Shaw's voice that, when spectrally inverted, mirrored the VLF whisper. It was a blueprint for the listener's original, pre-confirmation signal. Lena had the key data she needed, the original geometric signal from Shaw's voice and the negation theory from Kerr's journal. She left Shaw drawing her silent star, the silence of the hospital corridor feeling suddenly ominously loud. As Lena synthesized the data from Shaw's voice, Kerr's journal, and Thorne's schematic, she stumbled upon a terrible realization. The counter formula was itself a geometric pattern, albeit one based on chaos. Kerr had structured the negation using recursive mathematical sequences designed to induce a fatal computational overload. But if the listener was truly omni-geometric, as its global spread suggested, Then the chaos itself would be absorbed and categorized, becoming the ultimate confirmation of the listener's adaptability. Care's weapon was a recursive trap. Lena realized she needed to add a temporal element to the counter formula, a way to execute the chaotic broadcast at a moment that the listener could not predict or integrate. The listener had initiated its original cycle during a specific astronomical alignment, the solstice. To achieve perfect time symmetry, Lena needed a moment of anti-time, a geological or environmental event of absolute, unpredictable chaos. She scoured the Project Cassandra files for Care's archived notes on non-linear temporal anchors. She found a reference to a decommissioned military asset, a high-power broadcasting station located in the remote desert, capable of generating immense energy, but only if its unstable magnetohydrodynamic MHD generator could be brought back online. The location was far from any established grid, guaranteeing the necessary isolation. This station was the last piece of the physical puzzle. Lena started the long, desperate drive west. The desert heat, a welcome distraction from the cold geometry forming in her eye. The observer's scar was now a constant, low-grade throb. Lena found that the only way to retain cognitive clarity was to use a specific technique, linguistic denial. Every time she needed to think about a concept related to the counter formula, e.g., frequency, chaos, amplitude, she would consciously replace the word in her mind with an unrelated, non-contextual term, like mango, blue, or smooth. She was fighting the listener's core need for confirmation through language. This mental trick allowed her to continue analyzing Kerr's complex counter formula in her notebook. She broke down the formula into three key components: instability, the energy source; denial, the broadcast array; and the non-verbal trigger, the final input. The instability required the MHD generator. The denial required rewiring the radio dish for asynchronous output. The trigger remained the most terrifying unknown. Kerr's journal hinted at a final act of sensory overload. The observer must fail to rationalize the final input. She realized the trigger had to be delivered directly to the eye, the listener's primary sensor. A flash of light, perhaps, or a sound so intense it bypassed conscious thought. As she considered this, she noticed that the simple geometric asterisk in her eye seemed to be changing. The 8 lines were now curving subtly, showing that the listener had already begun to incorporate her attempts at denial into its evolving new geometry. It was a flexible, terrifying foe, confirming that Kerr's original counter formula was already compromised. She had to improvise. Lena drove through the endless, unchanging landscape, the monotonous rhythm of the highway, providing a hypnotic backdrop to her internal battle. The new geometry was manifesting now, using the vast, ordered systems of human infrastructure. She saw it in the long ruler, straight lines of the roads, the perfect parabolic curves of the bridges, and the precise, repeating rhythm of the telephone poles. These structural elements were becoming the new, global inertial medium, silently forming vast, interlocking segments of the 8, flashed asterisk on a continental scale. The listener was nearly fully deployed. She stopped for gas, and the geometric influence was palpable. The patterns on the plastic gas pump, the reflective surface of the display, all of it seemed to align into temporary, shifting segments of the schematic. A sense of impending final order was pressing in, a cosmic certainty that terrified her far more than any monster. She pulled out Kerr's black journal for the 10th time, focusing on the coordinates he had scrawled in the margin next to the description of the high power broadcasting station, the Echo Point Array. She realized Kerr had always planned for the geometric takeover to happen. His counter formula was not a fix. It was a desperate, elegant solution to be deployed at the very last moment, a weapon of necessary chaos. She was now only a few hours away from the array. The geometric scar in her eye no longer just a physical mark, but a direct line of sight into the mind of the entity she was determined to deny. Upon reviewing Kerr's Project Cassandra files, Lena found a map of the Blackwood Creek area, not drawn on paper, but meticulously carved into a sheet of polished granite. It was an ultra-precise geological survey, charting the granite density beneath the surface. Overlaid on this map, Kerr had used black ink to highlight a circular, multi-layered antenna array, the original cancellation field, and then, in furious slashes of deep red, had obscured the central coordinates. The map, she realized, was a physical model of the zero space. The coordinates Kerr had blacked out were those of the original VLF beacon, the point of first confirmation. Lena used a UV lamp to analyze the ink and found that Kerr hadn't used ink. He had used a chemical compound that actively canceled the light reflected from that point of the granite. The point was literally denied, physically refusing to exist in the light spectrum. This confirmed Kerr's core principle. To fight the listener, one had to achieve physical denial, not just conceptual. She realized her code of denial, using substitute words, was a subconscious reflection of this physical denial. The listener, however, had already adapted. The geometric scar in her eye now subtly filtered all visual input, emphasizing lines of symmetry in the landscape. A subtle, constant reassertion of the new geometry. She saw a single photograph stuck to the back of the granite map, a picture of a young lucid Daniel Kerr standing next to the enormous, tilted dish of the Echo Point array. Her target was confirmed. The observer's scar was now giving Lena profound headaches, forcing her to find a way to interpret the listener's transmission without relying on visual input. She returned to the raw VLF audio recordings she took from the defunct Blackwood Creek outpost. She filtered out the VLF whisper and was left with the ambient noise, the low, chaotic hiss of atmospheric static. She noticed that the amplitude of the static was not random. It contained minute, high-speed pulsing, a subtle, non-linguistic form of communication. She sped up the recording by a factor of 10,000, and the static resolved into an agonizingly fast sequence of binary clicks. It was the listener's true language geometric binary. A 1 represented a confirmation of symmetry. A 0 represented a brief instance of chaos. The sequence she deciphered was overwhelmingly 1s interspersed with tiny, failing bursts of 0s, the remnants of Kerr's collapsing cancellation field, fighting back. She was listening to the entire world being overwritten by the grand confirmation schema. She realized that the listener was evolving its communication. It was not using sound or vision. It was using the probability of noise. Lena used the geometric binary sequence to refine the counter formula for the Echo Point array. The chaotic signal she needed to broadcast had to be a pure, relentless stream of randomized 0s, a signal of absolute, statistically proven entropy. Lena continued to analyze Kerr's black journal, focusing on the black box protocol, a set of instructions for the final moments of the counter. Formula S execution. Kerr had foreseen the observer's compromise. The protocol stated that the counter formula must be reduced to its simplest geometric components. Then the mathematical values must be physically rendered and destroyed at the exact moment of transmission. This was the ultimate act of self-denial, creating the key, then destroying the key before the observer, Lena, could linguistically confirm it. This physical act of destruction would momentarily blind the listener, forcing the geometric entity to confront its own physical negation. Lena found a small box in Kerr. Supplies, a heavy, lead-lined container labeled non-verbal trigger apparatus. Inside, she found a series of intricately etched glass prisms, each calibrated to a specific chaotic coefficient of the formula. The final instruction was chilling. The prisms must be smashed by the observer's own hand at the final second. The shattering glass provides the unanalyzable entropy. This was Kerr's solution for the non-verbal trigger, the act of breaking the geometric certainty of the prisms, delivered directly through the observer as sense of touch and sound, would provide the necessary informational overload. The scar in her eye burned as she read this, the listener fighting back against the idea of its sensory overload. Lena knew that the destruction of the prisms was the destruction of the formula. She would be left with a fractured mind and no path back. As Lena got closer to the echo point array, she began to understand why Kerr had chosen the Deep Plains desert for the final confrontation. It wasn't just for the isolation and the MHD generator. The desert itself was an optimal medium for the anti-pattern. The vast, flat, empty geography provided an expansive, yet minimal, inertial medium. A landscape with low, natural entropy. The listener prefers urban environments which are dense with predictable, human-made symmetry grids, roads, patterns of life. The desert was a vast canvas of natural, minimal chaos. The anti-pattern would spread faster here. Lena noticed the geometric influence changing as she drove. Instead of using structures, the listener was using the natural environment for its new geometry. The ripples in the sand dunes, normally random, now resolved into sweeping, calculated curves that matched the outer spirals of the asterisk schematic. The occasional desert scrub brush seemed to grow in unnaturally ordered, circular patterns. The listener was adapting to the minimal chaos of the desert by imposing even finer geometric detail on the environment. Lena felt the observer's scar pulse with a cold excitement. The entity was eager to finalize its design using the ultimate, untouched canvas. She increased her speed, feeling the race against the listener's final, perfect geometric expression drawing to an unbearable climax. Lena stopped at a rundown roadside hardware store to pick up materials for rewiring the echo point array. High-gauge copper wiring, phase inverters, and high tensile safety gloves. As she selected the items, she felt the listener actively trying to undermine her task through her own professional knowledge. The geometric scar seemed to highlight flaws in the wiring specifications, suggesting an easier symmetrical path that would lead to catastrophic feedback. It was the engineer's curse using Lena's innate desire for technical perfection to build a flawless trap for herself. She fought back, forcing her mind to introduce deliberate imperfections into the schematic she was mentally planning. A slight phase mismatch here, a less than ideal gauge wire there. She had to build the anti-geometric array, using the logic of intentional failure. The listener, desperate for confirmation, kept trying to guide her toward a clean, elegant solution. But Lena knew elegance was a death sentence. She chose the most chaotic, non-standard components, ensuring the final broadcast would be as mathematically noisy as possible. When she went to pay, the total bill came out to an unnaturally perfect, repeating decimal value, $44.44. The cashier, a tired, silent man, made no attempt to round it. It was a subtle, final confirmation from the listener, using the mundane symmetry of currency to remind her that order was inevitable. Lena paid the exact amount in a messy mix of coins and drove away, the number burning in her memory. To complete the counter formula, Lena still needed a viable time element, a moment of geological or astronomical chaos that the listener could not predict. Kerr's journal provided the theoretical framework, temporal denial. He theorized that the listener, having started its cycle during a major astronomical confirmation, the solstice, required a moment of absolute temporal certainty to finalize its global geometry. To defeat it, the broadcast had to be anchored to a non-recurrent event, an unpredictable moment of pure entropy. Lena found an archived Project Cassandra memorandum detailing a known high-altitude geological fault line located 120 miles north of the Echo Point array. The memo indicated the fault was under immense, non-linear stress, predicted to undergo a minor, spontaneous seismic correction sometime in the next few months. This was the time element, a naturally occurring event of geological chaos, impossible to predict with precise certainty, but statistically guaranteed. Kerr had scrawled a note next to the memo. The flash of light and the seismic event must coincide. Chaos confirmed by chaos. The observer must fail to rationalize the time element. Lena realized she could to rely on the exact moment. She would have to set up a 5-minute window for the chaotic broadcast, hoping the seismic event occurred within that highly unstable time frame. Lena spent the next day testing the integrity of her mind against the listener's influence. The entity was no longer imposing simple geometric visions. It was now attacking her core logic and reason. Every thought Lena had about the counter formula was immediately countered by a flawless logical argument from the listener, embedded as a sudden, undeniable flash of reason within her own thought processes. If chaos is the poison, then a perfect dose of chaos is itself an order. Therefore, your anti-pattern is a delayed confirmation. The listener was employing the logic trap. Lena realized the only way to beat it was to operate on pure instinct and contradiction. She had to deny the premise of her own actions. The formula, as chaotic coefficients needed to be felt, not calculated. She began to rely entirely on the chaotic geometric binary sequence she had deciphered from the VLF static, using the patterns of 0, S, and 1. It's not as code, but as a random, non-contextual decision-making engine. If the sequence showed a 1 confirmation, she would choose the opposite action. If it showed a 0, chaos, she would choose the path of maximum instability. She was turning her actions into a weapon of contradiction. The observer, SR, began to ache with intense frustration. The listener was failing to find a stable pattern in her actions, caught between her professional logic, which it controlled, and her instinctual contradiction, which it could not. Lena finally assembled the 3 components of Kerr's non-verbal trigger, the xenon arc lamp, the plunger switch, and the heavy lead-lined box containing the prismatic key. She opened the box. Inside were 4 hand-sized, perfectly cut glass prisms. They were not geometric shapes. They were shapes that defied easy description. Non-repeating, non-Euclidean facets that captured the light and broke it down into pure, agonizingly random noise. Each prism represented a core component of the counter formula: instability, denial, entropy, and time. The final instruction was clear. The observer must smash the 4 keys simultaneously with the main power switch activation. The violent, random sound and physical feedback of the glass shattering would provide the required, unanalyzable sensory overload. Lena put the prisms aside and started testing the xenon arc lamp. The flash it generated was blinding, leaving deep, purple afterimages that temporarily overwhelmed the observer's geometric filtering. She was practicing her own cognitive self-destruction. The listener, sensing the impending sensory attack, started projecting images into her mind. Images of Thorn, Agnes Shaw, and Kerr. Their eyes burned white and wide, all staring at her, a silent warning of the consequence of geometric sight overload. She fought the terror, knowing this was the only path to the listener's denial. As Lena began the detailed work of rewiring the massive 150-foot parabolic dish at the Echo Point array, she found her greatest challenge was the dish itself. It was a marvel of symmetrical engineering, a perfect parabolic curve designed for focused, ordered transmission. It was, in essence, a giant geometric schematic, waiting to be confirmed. To create the anti-geometric array, she had to destroy its function without physically breaking it. She began injecting the chaotic differentials into the phased array feed horn, deliberately introducing phase errors and signal distortion into the wiring. The process was agonizing. Every wire she crossed, every circuit she corrupted, was met with a surge of pain and confirmation from the observer. A scar, which seemed to writhe beneath her skin, the listener was begging her for order, suggesting a simpler, cleaner way to generate power. She focused on Kerr, scrawled equations, the principles of asynchronous output and multi-band jamming. She was building a chaotic antenna, a weapon of pure noise. She finished the main wiring, and the dish let out a low, mechanical moan, fighting the new destructive logic. Lena placed the final component, a custom, built phase inverter designed to create a momentary, total feedback loop, and stepped back. The dish was no longer a symbol of scientific order. It was a vast, chaotic machine, the perfect canvas of denial. The full system was ready for power. Lena entered the control bunker for the final time. The MHD generator was her last, most crucial task. Its power source, the superheated, corrosive salt slurry, was the medium of pure instability. She needed to bypass every safety interlock to allow the generator to output raw, unfiltered, and potentially destructive power. As she worked on the final bypass circuits, the listener, using the observer's cognitive link, presented her with complex, perfectly calculated failure scenarios. If you bypass this circuit, the resultant feedback will vaporize the corrosive slurry, destroying the instability and rendering the formula inert. You must retain the secondary cooling mechanism. The listener was trying to guide her toward a predictable failure. Lena countered the logic by following Kerr's principle of contradiction. She bypassed every interlock, including the secondary cooling mechanism, embracing the possibility of catastrophic self-destruction. She needed the engine to be as unstable as possible, defying all mechanical certainty. The generator began to hum, a deep, unsettling vibration that resonated in her teeth. The scent of ozone and heated metal filled the air. She pulled the last safety release. The generator was now an uncontrolled force of raw, chaotic energy, ready to be channeled by the anti-geometric array. She now had the instability and the denial. The only thing left was the non-verbal trigger, the moment of cognitive self-immolation. Lena sat in the sterile anonymity of the motel room. Daniel Kerr's journal open before her. The scrawled equations of the counter formula were her only hope, a mathematical negation of the listener's destructive geometry. But every time she focused on the intricate pattern of organized chaos, she felt the scar in her left eye. The 8 asterisk tingle, a cold, sickening sensation that was purely cognitive. It wasn't pain. It was the feeling of being intensely understood. The listener was using her own sensory input, her own mind, as its primary observation post. The visual disturbances started subtly. She would glance at the striped wallpaper and see the stripes momentarily coalesce into segments of the asterisk. The dust motes floating in the shaft of morning light didn't move randomly. They traced minute, perfect fractal spirals, obeying a hidden geometric law. The world was being overwritten by the entity's freed consciousness. She ran her analysis on the counter. Formula: a set of chaotic differentials designed to nullify the VLF wave's tonal resonance. It was brilliant, relying on the principle of anti-patterning, introducing unpredictable, noisy variables to collapse the listener's rigid symmetry. Kerr had intuited that the listener was addicted to order, to the predictable confirmation of its own existence. Chaos, then, was its poison. But the moment she finalized a variable, turning a chaotic concept into a definitive, named value, $vef noise $20 for the noise variable, or $T20 disrupt order for the time disruption, the scar in her eye would burn. It was a warning. Naming the variables provided the listener with the very confirmation it craved, allowing it to integrate the chaos into its new, flexible geometry. She realized her struggle wasn't against the entity outside. It was against the entity inside, which was trying to translate her abstract thoughts into concrete, usable data. She had to work in concepts in unspoken mathematics, communicating the design only through the physical act of drawing and erasing, never through language. She found a large roll of butcher paper and began sketching the counter, formula on the floor, using charcoal, its impermanence a comfort. The pattern quickly grew vast and complex, covering the entire floor. As she knelt amidst the charcoal dust, she accidentally caught her reflection in the dark television screen. The small asterisk in her eye was faintly, unmistakably glowing. She was the only observer, and the listener was now looking out at the world through her. It was preparing to use her geometric sight to execute its next terrifying phase of the Blackwood cycle. She packed quickly, realizing the motel room was too small, too sterile. She needed a place with raw, powerful infrastructure, a stage large enough to enact Kerr's final, desperate act of defiance. The further Lena drove from Blackwood Creek, the more subtle and yet more pervasive the signs of the new geometry became. It wasn't just the scar in her eye. It was the world itself reacting to the listener's freedom. The energy of the shattered cancellation field had dispersed, acting like a seed crystal for geometric order within natural chaos. She noticed it first in the power grid. Long distance power lines seemed to sag and curve in impossible, perfectly calculated catenaries, forming vast, unseen segments of the asterisk. At a highway rest stop, the cracks in the asphalt of the parking lot no longer seemed random. They radiated from a central manhole covered in sickeningly precise, fractal lines mirroring the non-Euclidean angles. Kerr had scrawled in his desperate final notes. This wasn't local superstition. It was a global infection of pattern, a systemic error introduced into the laws of probability. The listener wasn't a contained threat anymore. It was a fundamental shift in reality. She realized the counter formula was exponentially harder to execute now. In Blackwood Creek, the geometry was static, carved in concrete. Now, it was dynamic, using the ambient structure of human society and the natural environment. To disrupt it, she needed an energy source capable of generating pure, chaotic interference on a colossal scale, and a broadcasting medium powerful enough to push the anti-pattern against the listener's global fractalization. She found her target via a combination of archived military documents and Kerr's coded margin notes, the Echo Point Array, a decommissioned Cold War-era radio astronomy observatory located deep in the High Plains Desert. It possessed a massive, decaying parabolic dish designed to capture faint stellar energy but which could, if rewired, be used to broadcast an immense, chaotic signal. Crucially, the site had been abandoned because its original power source, a liquid-fueled magnetohydrodynamic generator, was deemed too unstable and dangerous. Instability and danger were exactly what Kerr's anti-pattern required. During the drive, she reread Kerr's surly, more lucid notes. He had emphasized that the counter formula required an inertial medium, a vast non-cognitive entity that could hold the chaos without trying to rationalize it. The listener used minds. The counter formula needed something immune to confirmation. Kerr had theorized about liquid helium or highly pressurized plasma. The observatory's generator used a superheated, corrosive salt slurry, a medium that could potentially hold the chaotic energy long enough for transmission. She drove on, the desert vast and empty, the scar in her eye itching with a dreadful anticipation. She was heading toward the final confrontation, a clash between cosmic order and organized human chaos. Lena pulled Kerr's sworn journal out of the glove compartment, the desert sun bleaching the paper. She was looking for the theoretical bedrock of the counter formula. Kerr's meticulous early sketches detailed the geometric requirements for the observer's trap in Blackwood Creek, but the later pages outlined the weapon needed to negate it, a weapon that was fundamentally anti-knowledge. Kerr had theorized that the listener, operating on pure cognitive energy, could only thrive in perfect symmetry and linguistic confirmation. To destroy it, one needed to inject a signal that was both mathematically chaotic and utterly unnameable. He noted the counter formula needed three things: a medium of pure instability. The energy source must be inherently non-predictable, defying the listener. Core need for geometric order. The echo point array, magnetohydrodynamic MHD generator, with its violently unstable salt slurry, fit this perfectly. The canvas of denial. The geometry must be drawn out, not on a mental plane, but on a vast physical medium. A canvas capable of holding the anti-pattern without decay. Kerr's solution was a pulsed radio, frequency field broadcast at multiple chaotic bands simultaneously. The radio dish itself would become the new anti-geometric schematic, the non-verbal trigger. The final activation signal could not be a thought, a word, or a number. It had to be a pure, instantaneous sensory input that could not be rationalized. A total information overload delivered directly to the observer. Sigh. Lena stared at the last requirement. The observer, sigh. Her eye, the scarred asterisk, pulsed faintly, feeling like a tiny, frozen lens. The listener was inside, using her mind as its final calculator, trying to anticipate her every move. Kerr's formula dictated that the only way to successfully execute the anti-pattern was to deliver a shock that would temporarily overload the observer's cognitive link, forcing the listener to experience pure, unnameable chaos through its own primary sensor. She realized the terrifying implication. The counter formula required her to deliberately, momentarily break her own mind at the point of activation. She was required to become a perfect non-cognitive transmitter. The memory of Elias Thorne, his eyes burned white and wide open, flashed in her mind. He was the prototype for the failed observation. She was about to be the prototype for the deliberate, controlled cognitive self-immolation. She gripped the steering wheel, the desert sun beating down on her, fully aware that the cost of saving the world from the geometry would likely be the ultimate surrender of her own sanity. She was hours away from the array, the geometric scar a burning reminder of the entity that awaited her arrival. The Echo Point Array was a monstrous, beautiful relic of the Cold War, a complex of half-buried bunkers and the towering 150-foot parabolic dish, now tilted and silent, staring up at the eternal blue of the high-altitude desert sky. The site was miles from the nearest road, a perfect geographical expression of isolation. Lena parked her 4 times, 4 beneath the rusted skeletal frame of the dish, and climbed out. The air here was dry and thin, devoid of the suffocating silence of Blackwood Creek, but replaced by a profound, arid stillness that felt equally unnatural. The silence in the valley had been a cancellation. This silence felt like a massive expectation. She located the main control bunker, a heavy, air-locked door secured by a simple, rusted bolt. Inside, the equipment was dated but intact. Banks of vacuum tube components, massive transformers, and the humming, inert core of the MHD generator, its pipes filled with the corrosive salt slurry. This was her laboratory, her final battlefield. The first step was locating the schematics for the parabolic dish's primary feed horn. The transmitter element. She found the blueprints in a dusty metal filing cabinet, a circular arrangement of 24 phased array transmitters, designed for deep space communication. It was the perfect canvas for Scotic broadcast. As she worked, the scar in her eye began to pulse with a low, insistent throb. The geometric shape in her iris felt like it was expanding, pushing against the bone of her skull. It was a pressure cooker sensation. The listener knew its pattern was here. The observer was under direct cognitive fire. Suddenly, she saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible discoloration on the wall behind a defunct oscilloscope. It was a single, repeating pattern of faint, light, brown mold growing in the corner. The pattern wasn't T-random. It was tracing the outer loop of the 8-lashed asterisk, a natural, environmental manifestation of the listener's new geometry. The entity was already using the passive biological processes of the environment to assert its presence, a subtle, terrifying confirmation of its adaptability. Lena felt a spike of panic. She was contaminating the inertial medium just by being here. The listener was observing her movements, anticipating her actions, and writing its influence into the very architecture around her. She had to act fast before the entire site became a segment of the new geometry. She needed to start the MHD generator to flood the environment with a chaotic, overwhelming energy source that would drown out the subtle geometric intrusions. She began checking the pressure valves, the metallic scent of the corrosive salt slurry filling the thin desert air. The final stage of the cycle of defiance was commencing. Lena worked through the night, running diagnostics on the MHD generator. The machine was designed for raw, overwhelming power, enough to run a small city, and the salt slurry contained within its pressurized pipes was intensely chaotic in its flow, perfect for the anti-pattern. She began bypassing the main safety interlocks, preparing the generator to output raw, unfiltered power. As she wired the massive power lines to the parabolic dish's feed horn, a high-pitched, metallic whine started emanating from the dish itself. Despite the power being off, it wasn't an electrical noise. It was an atmospheric resonance, a harmonic feedback loop between the giant metal structure and the empty sky. It was the listener, now using the dish as an amplifier for its cognitive transmission. She returned to the control room and turned on an old radio receiver she found. It was instantly overwhelmed by static, a chaotic roar of white noise. But within the static, she heard the same sound she had recorded in Blackwood Creek, the rapid high-frequency chatter of thousands of voices, layered together, organized into an algorithm of panic. Then, a single clear voice sliced through the noise. It wasn't T. Agnes. It was Daniel Kerr. The formula is elegant, Lena, but it is only a mirror. Mirrors can be turned. The listener wasn't T speaking. It was using Kerr's archived cognitive residue, accessing the pure fear and knowledge of the previous confirmer, filtering it through the static. It was trying to use the voice of the dead to trigger a linguistic confirmation of the counter. Formula's flaws. Lena slammed her hands over the radio, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was hallucinating, or the listener was projecting. She realized the entity didn't need to physically see the formula. It simply needed to hear its concept named in a moment of crisis. She focused on the scar in her eye. It was burning now, a throbbing reminder of the entity. Its direct presence. She reached for the field journal and tore out the final page, the one containing the counter formula. She did not earn it. Instead, she taped it to the largest available surface in the control room, the blank, metallic chassis of a primary transformer. The formula was now outside her mind, externalized into the inertial medium of the machine. She quickly pulled out a can of industrial spray paint and began covering the intricate mathematical patterns of the formula, obscuring the angles and numbers in a thick coat of matte black. The formula had to be physically present for the observer, Lena, to initiate the non-verbal trigger, but it could not be readable for the confirmer, the listener within. She had rendered the data functionally unnameable while retaining its physical structure. The metallic smell of the paint briefly overpowered the listener's transmission. Lena knew the entity would now try to use her own mind to reconstruct the obscured geometry. The battle had become a race against her own memory. The observer's scar was now a constant, dull ache, and Lena felt a growing, profound difficulty in forming clear, structured thoughts. The listener, deprived of visual confirmation of Kerr's formula, was attempting to extract the pattern directly from her short-term memory, introducing a cognitive static that made focus almost impossible. Lena fought through the haze, her hands moving instinctively as she began the final wiring of the dish. The counter formula, now represented by the obscured mathematical pattern on the transformer, required the phased array of the dish to broadcast an anti-geometric signal. The original array was designed for synchronous, focused transmission order. She needed to rewire it for asynchronous, chaotic output. She found the main distribution panel, a vast metal grid of bus bars and relays. She started wiring the 24 transmitters, deliberately creating short circuits, phase inversions, and ground loops. She was building the new physical schematic, the anti-geometric array, using the logic of Kerr's chaotic differentials. The dish was becoming a chaotic antenna. The risk was enormous. One mistake, and the resulting feedback loop would vaporize the entire control bunker. As she worked, the listener projected images into her mind, not sound, but pure, terrifying geometric concepts. She saw the entire continental United States as a single, shifting arrangement of asterisks and spirals, using the highway systems and power grids as its new connective tissue. It was showing her the scale of the confirmation she had released. It was tempting her to stop, to let the geometric perfection consume her, promising her a place in its infinite order. She focused on the smell of the ozone from the transformer, the rough texture of the copper wire, anything to ground her in the real, non-geometric world. She successfully wired the final phase inversion, and the massive parabolic dish, now connected to the unstable MHD generator, began to hum softly, not the deep resonance of the listener, but a chaotic, high-pitched whirring that defied fixed frequency. She needed to set the time element, the window of peak chaotic output. Kerr's notes had stressed that the chaotic broadcast had to overwhelm the listener's time component. The solstice alignment, to prevent its rapid geometric reorganization, setting it too early would be ineffective, too late, and the new geometry would be too entrenched. She looked at her calendar. The original solstice alignment was still months away. The listener was free, operating outside the old rigid time component. It needed a new one. She realized she could wait for the next astronomical event. She had to create the time. She needed a moment of absolute environmental purity, a naturally occurring temporal nexus, to execute the counter formula. She scanned the old observatory logs, searching for a moment of predictable, local entropy. Lena, as paranoia was no longer just a cognitive battle, it was becoming a physical certainty. She left the control bunker for a brief rest, retreating to a small, untouched storage closet she deemed geometrically innocent. But even here, the influence of the listener's new geometry was asserting itself. She laid her jacket down on the floor, and as the desert light filtered through a narrow vent, the dust on the floor began to move. Not air currents, but a slow, deliberate migration. The individual grains were arranging themselves into minute, complex geometric shapes, perfect, tiny spirals that tiled the floor in a pattern of repeating, ordered chaos. The fractal growth was using inert material to replicate the listener's influence. She stood frozen, watching the dust. The geometric scar in her eye was throbbing in sync with the dust's movement. Confirmation is everywhere. The listener projected into her thoughts a cold, dry certainty. The counter formula is just another beautiful pattern. Lena, it is chaos, but chaos is merely symmetry on a higher order. I will simply absorb your noise and use it to perfect my next cycle. She looked at her hand. Her skin looked subtly wrong, the pores and wrinkles seeming to align into faint, interlocking polygonal shapes. The listener was trying to write the pattern into her very flesh, turning her from observer into the physical schematic itself. Fighting a wave of nausea, she slammed the journal shut. The final entry, the coordinates for the temporal nexus, was her focus. She found the coordinates Kerr had scrawled, an area 120 miles north of the array, a high-altitude geological fault line that was due for a minor, but predictable seismic correction in 3 hours. A moment of pure, raw geological entropy, the Earth's own natural chaos. This was the new time element, a perfect moment of natural instability. She had to transmit the counter formula at the precise second the seismic event occurred. The chaos of the broadcast would then be instantly confirmed by the chaos of the environment, overloading the listener's ability to find order in the combined signal. She raced back to the control bunker, the fear lending her a terrifying clarity. She reached the MHD generator, its pipes vibrating softly with pressurized instability. The time window was tight, 3 hours to prepare the final overload sequence and set the broadcast timer. She pulled the last safety release lever on the generator. The scent of ozone and heated salt slurry intensified. She was committed. The anti-pattern was ready to be broadcast, but she still needed the final, instantaneous, non-verbal trigger that would save her mind, even as it destroyed the pattern. Lena realized that the listener wasn't trying to stop her. It was trying to co-opt her. By allowing her to build the anti-geometric array, it was setting a trap. When she executed the counter formula, the resulting chaos would be instantly absorbed, analyzed, and integrated making the listener exponentially stronger. The entity had already integrated Kerr's data and Shaw's resonance. Lena's chaos would be the final, necessary confirmation of its geometric adaptability. She prepared the control console, setting a 5-minute countdown timer linked to the seismic event's predicted time window. She linked the timer to the MHD generator's main output switch, ensuring the power surge would be instantaneous. She then focused on the non-verbal trigger, the part of Kerr's plan designed to momentarily shatter her own cognitive link with the listener. Kerr's notes were specific. The observer must be overwhelmed by a pure singular sensory input that cannot be rationalized. Sight is the listener's strength. Use it against itself. Lena looked around the dusty control room for the medium. A mirror would allow the listener to observe itself, providing perfect, instant confirmation. A flashlight would be too weak. She needed pure light. She found an old, powerful xenon arc lamp, a relic used for calibrating the dish. Sitting in a maintenance crate, it was capable of generating a searing, blinding flash of white light, a concentrated dose of visible chaos. She mounted the lamp directly opposite the main viewing window of the control bunker. She wired the lamp to a secondary power source, bypassing the main generator, and attached a simple manual plunger switch. She ran to the window. Outside, the great parabolic dish was humming softly with the potential energy of the MHD generator, a vast, silent, chaotic transmitter aimed at the thin desert sky. She looked up at the smooth glass of the window, seeing her reflection. The geometric scar in her eye was unmistakable now, a deep, silver asterisk set in her iris, the perfect observer. And as she stared, her reflection shifted, not physically, but cognitively. The silver asterisk in her eye seemed to widen, and the reflection looking back at her was not the face of a terrified woman, but a pure geometric pattern of light and shadow, organized by the 8-lashed symbol. The listener was showing her its true self, staring out through her reflection. You are the ultimate expression of the cycle, Lena. You are the confirmation that contains your own denial. She broke the gaze, the terrifying vision shattering. She knew what she had to do. The final act was self-destruction. She had to hold the counter formula in her mind until the last second, flip the main power switch, and simultaneously plunge the xenon lamp, delivering a flash of pure, unnameable light directly into the observer. With 45 minutes remaining until the predicted time of the seismic correction, Lena had to perform a controlled experiment. She needed to know the physical limits of the counter formula and the listener's instantaneous reaction to it. She could not risk a full broadcast without understanding the destructive feedback. She isolated a small, low, power directional antenna attached to the main dish, bypassing the main chaotic array. She then introduced a minuscule 5-second burst of curve, Santi-pattern signal through the antenna, using a fraction of the MHD generator's power, while simultaneously observing a nearby section of the desert ground through a pair of high magnification binoculars. She initiated the test sequence. 3, 2, 1. The 5-second burst of anti-geometric chaos flowed through the small antenna, broadcasting a tight beam into the empty desert. The effect was immediate and horrifying. A patch of sand 50 feet wide at the point of impact did not explode or burn. It simply ceased to exist. It was not vaporized or displaced. The very concept of that section of sand was revoked. The space was replaced by a smooth, perfectly hemispherical void, a black, light, absorbing geometric pocket where reality had been deleted. The counter formula worked. It was the poison Kerr intended. It introduced such a profound, unanalyzable entropy that the geometric certainty of the listener and the physical certainty of reality collapsed. But the reaction was violent. The instant the void appeared, the observer, Scar and Lena, his eye pulsed so violently that she cried out, stumbling backward. The listener retaliated instantly. The air in the control bunker did not move, but the temperature plummeted instantaneously, causing the remaining safety glass on the console to fracture in a precise fractal spiral pattern, echoing the new geometry. The listener was trying to write its order back into the chaos. Lena gasped, clutching her eye. She looked at the timer, 42 minutes remaining. She had created a tear in the fabric of reality, and the listener had tried to use the event to perfect its geometric response. She realized that the full-scale broadcast, designed to encompass the listener's global influence, would not just create a void, it would risk collapsing the entire geometric foundation of the planet. She now understood the final, awful requirement of the counter formula. It had to be an all or nothing moment of total equilibrium. The chaos of the broadcast had to perfectly balance the chaos of the seismic event, creating a momentary zero, some geometric equation that would cancel the listener without collapsing reality entirely. She had one chance. She checked the clock. The time was set. She loaded the xenon arc lamp safety circuit. The only thing left was the non-verbal trigger. The moment of cognitive suicide, 20 minutes until the time of the seismic event. Lena was standing at the main control panel. Every wire, every relay, every bypass circuit meticulously checked and rechecked. The MHD generator was roaring now, a deep, unsettling mechanical groan as it drew power from its unstable salt slurry, creating the perfect medium of pure instability. She looked at the obscured counter formula taped to the transformer. It was unreadable, unnameable, ready to be broadcast. She ran her finger over the black paint, memorizing the last chaotic sequence before it was lost forever. The listener was silent now, its cognitive transmission having ceased entirely. It was waiting, patient, absolutely certain that its embedded observer, Lena, would fail to execute the final step correctly, thus providing the ultimate, perfect confirmation of its geometric power. Lena knew her fate was sealed. Whether she succeeded or failed, the listener would have the data. Success meant cognitive self-immolation. Failure meant the geometric takeover of the planet. The only variable left was intent. She had to execute the chaos with a perfect, non-linguistic will to deny the pattern. She took her position, facing the window. The vast, cold, parabolic dish loomed outside, ready to become the canvas of denial. The xenon arc lamp was armed on the stand beside her, its lens a blinding white promise. 5 minutes to the time. She began the final system sequence. The noise from the MHD generator climbed in pitch, a high-frequency scream of raw, chaotic power. The air in the bunker grew thick with the smell of ozone and energized metal. 1 minute to the time. She placed her left hand on the main generator output switch. Her right hand hovered over the plunger switch for the xenon lamp. Her breath was shallow, her heart a frantic, panicked drum against the silence of the waiting entity in her mind. 10 seconds. She looked at her reflection in the glass, the terrified woman, the silver asterisk burning brightly in her eye. The observer was ready. 5, 4. She closed her eyes, denying the listener its final visual input. She had to act on pure sensory timing. 3, She felt the first, subtle tremor through the concrete floor. The seismic correction had begun, the geological chaos erupting 120 miles away. The time was now. 2. She felt the listener lunge inside her mind, a frantic, cognitive spike of recognition, attempting to read the counter formula directly from her memory before the final second. 1. Lena slammed both switches simultaneously. The MHD generator roared into absolute, violent life, flooding the dish with the chaotic anti-pattern. And at the exact same instant, the xenon arc lamp exploded in a searing, blinding flash of pure white light, aimed directly at the observer. Its closed eyes overloading the geometric scar with the one thing the listener could not rationalize: unnameable light. The control bunker was instantly consumed by chaos and blinding, agonizing light. The world ended not with a bang, but with a blinding, agonizing flash of pure white light and the scream of raw, unfiltered energy. The xenon arc lamp achieved its purpose, overloading the observer's cognitive link. Lena's last sensation was the feeling of her mind being ripped into a billion unnameable fragments. When consciousness returned, it was not whole. She was lying on the cold concrete floor of the control bunker. The air was thick with ozone and the stench of burnt metal. The MHD generator was silent, having achieved its chaotic zenith and violently destroyed itself. The parabolic dish outside was also silent, smoke rising from its feed horn. The anti-pattern had been broadcast. Lena opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the silver asterisk in her left eye. It was flickering, a rapidly alternating pattern of light and dark, struggling to resolve itself. The listener was not gone. It was fractured. The counter formula had hit its mark, shattering the entity's rigid geometry, but the shock had also shattered the observer's mind. The new reality was a silence even deeper than Blackwood Creek, a world where the laws of probability had become violently unstable. Lena slowly pushed herself up. She looked at the transformer. The black paint had vaporized, revealing the counter formula beneath. But the symbols were subtly unstable, shifting and wavering, as if they were drawn on liquid. The geometric schema was now alive, but chaotic, no longer static. She felt a new, profound sense of dislocation. The cost of denial was not just her sanity, it was the fragile consistency of the universe. Lena stumbled out of the shattered control bunker. The world had not been destroyed, but it was profoundly wrong. The effects of the successful counter formula were subtle, but terrifying. The laws of physics had been replaced by the new laws of entropy. In the distance, she saw the effect of the chaotic broadcast on the geology, the high-altitude fault line. The seismic event S-time anchor was no longer a fault line, but a vast, smooth, unnaturally curved expanse of glassified rock, perfectly following a non-Euclidean arc. It was geological chaos molded into impossible order. The most unnerving effect was on the dust. The desert dust motes, instead of falling, seemed to hang in the air, shifting in organized, repeating clouds that defied gravity. She realized the listener's pursuit of confirmation had been violently thwarted, resulting in an environment where order and chaos were constantly wrestling. Minute by minute, the silver asterisk in her eye was still flickering. She was caught between two worlds, the world of stable reality and the world of geometric instability. She needed to know the status of the listener. Had it been destroyed or merely displaced? She found an intact handheld radio receiver and scanned the VLF band. The signal was gone. The VLF whisper, The source of the geometry was gone, but in its place, a massive shifting field of pure white noise flooded the spectrum, overwhelming all communication. The noise was the listener's current state, an entity of infinite, unanalyzable entropy scattered across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. It was alive, but shattered. The observer now faced a threat that was not organized order, but boundless, hostile chaos. Lena began the long trek back toward civilization, the 4 times 4 having been rendered unusable by the generator's destructive feedback. Her cognitive state was rapidly deteriorating. The intentional sensory overload of the nonverbal trigger had shattered the rational filter of her mind. She experienced frequent, disorienting cognitive drifts, moments where she could no longer distinguish between memory and immediate perception. She would see the echo point array looming ahead, then blink, and find herself standing next to a familiar bookshelf from Thorne's old office, only to return violently to the desert path a second later. She was physically stable, but temporally and spatially lost. The flickering asterisk in her eye was the key. When it stabilized into a moment of pure silver light, she had a brief moment of absolute terrifying clarity. The geometric truth of the world. When it flickered to black, she experienced the chaotic hallucinations. The observer was struggling to choose between the new geometry, now unstable, and boundless entropy. This cognitive battle was mirrored in the world. She noticed that small, complex systems, like the internal workings of her broken watch, or the crystalline structure of desert minerals, were collapsing or reforming into impossible shapes every few seconds. She was radiating geometric instability and the counter formula. The effects were most pronounced immediately around her. She was a walking paradox, an engine of both chaotic destruction and fractured order. She realized that the listener was now trying to use her instability as its new means of confirmation, hoping to find order in her chaotic, shattered thoughts. Walking through the desert, Lena experienced a shift in the nature of probability. She called it the resonance of chance. Where the listener had enforced symmetry, the chaotic broadcast enforced extremity. Random events were magnified, becoming statistically certain. When she reached for water, the bottle was precisely where she needed it to be, but the cap was already off, balanced precariously on the edge of the rim. When she tripped on a rock, she fell not forward, but sideways, catching herself perfectly against a jutting, razor-sharp piece of glassified stone that should have cut her hand, but didn't. She was surviving on a constant stream of statistical near impossibility. The chaos wasn't random. It was a reflection of the fractured listener, still trying to find patterns even in its disembodied, entropic state. The flicker in her observer's eye was getting faster, the two worlds bleeding into each other. She began to hear the white noise from the VLF spectrum, not through a receiver, but internally. A constant abrasive hiss that denied all thought. The noise was becoming a language of its own. It wasn't the ordered chatter of Blackwood Creek. It was a vast, formless symphony of non-meaning. She realized this noise was the core of the fractured listener. The entity, now without a fixed geometric schematic, was attempting to rebuild its confirmation by observing the patterns of random human behavior, the chaos of the macro world. Lena knew she had to find a center of population, a place of predictable human chaos, to understand the listener's new mode of operation. After 2 days of walking, Lena reached the edge of a small, forgotten desert town. Oasis. The inhabitants were silent, moving with a stilted, unsettling synchronicity. They weren't geometrically ordered like the confirmed victims of Blackwood Creek. They were chaotically ordered. People walked into walls, then apologized to the wall, They would stop traffic, then start dancing in the street, only to suddenly return to their cars and drive perfectly. Their actions were statistically random, yet their movements were perfectly coordinated. It was the inversion of the listener's control, the enforcement of organized entropy. The fractured listener was using its boundless chaos to induce an unstable, collective madness. The observer SI confirmed it. When the asterisk was silver, she saw the hidden, chaotic equations governing their movement. When it was black, she saw only random, meaningless acts. Lena desperately needed stability. She entered a diner and sat at the counter. The waitress, a woman with eyes that constantly darted around the room, confirming nothing, served her coffee. The cup was filled to the absolute brim, defying the common probability of spillage, but the spoon was balanced vertically on the rim. The chaos was becoming an art form. Lena pulled out Care's journal. His final, panicked notes about the recursive trap suddenly seemed prophetic. The geometric denial is only the first act. The listener will not die. It will become its inverse. The next cycle is chaos as control. She was no longer fighting geometric order. She was fighting calculated chaos. Lena realized the listener's new strategy. It was using the resonance of chance to create a labyrinth of meaning the town of Oasis was a physical representation of this. The streets did not logically connect. They were rearranged every few hours by statistical anomaly. Buildings that were there one day were gone, the next, replaced by empty lots or new, randomly constructed structures. Navigating required absolute surrender to the chaotic flow. The observer's scar was now her only guide. Lena forced herself to enter a state of cognitive denial, to stop trying to find the meaning in the chaos. She moved when the silver asterisk was dominant, when the geometric equations of movement were briefly stable, and froze when it went black, when total entropy was dominant. She was learning to surf the chaos. She needed a powerful, stable communication hub to send a final warning. The town's old telephone exchange was the only structure that seemed immune to the constant flux. She forced her way inside. The equipment was old, but the main switchboard was humming with a low, organized frequency, a tiny pocket of stable order in the chaotic town. This was where the inertial medium of the human network remained untouched. But she wasn't alone. In the back room, a figure was sitting, covered in geometric dust motes, humming the pure, single tone of the old LF whisper. The figure in the back room of the telephone exchange was a man in an obsolete uniform. He was humming the pure LF tone, the original sound of the listener's rigid geometry. He was immune to the new laws of entropy. Lena approached slowly, her observer, SI analyzing the man. She saw no scar, no asterisk. He was not an observer, but a relay. He was an external anchor for the listener. Its original, ordered geometry, a tiny static beacon of the old cycle, preserved within the new chaos. His eyes were focused on the humming switchboard, his body a conduit for the old pattern. The man turned, his eyes lucid, but his voice was a flat, synthesized imitation of Daniel Kerr's voice from the static transmission. The chaos is unstable. Lena, the observer is needed for the final confirmation. I am the stable point. I am the counter. Confirmation, the listener, scattered into white noise, was attempting to re-establish its ordered identity by using the relay to confirm its original form. Lena realized the counter formula had created a duality, the chaos in her mind, the fractured observer, and the order in this man, the stable relay. To stop the final catastrophic reintegration, she had to destroy the relay and the tiny pocket of order he represented, but the relay was already moving, his actions perfectly ordered and predictable, a stark, terrifying contrast to the chaotic movements of the townspeople. He reached for the main power breaker of the telephone exchange, intent on bringing the entire hub into the geometric fold. Lena knew she could outfight the relay's perfect, predictable movements. His actions were guided by absolute geometric certainty. She had to fight certainty with statistical impossibility. She grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, a perfect cylinder of potential instability, and analyzed the scenario with her observer. Zai. The relay's movement to the breaker followed a precise, predictable path. To intercept him, she could rely on speed. She had to rely on a sudden, unresolvable failure of probability. As the relay reached for the breaker, Lena executed her plan. She threw the fire extinguisher straight up, high above the relay's head. The relay, governed by linear, fixed point geometry, ignored the chaos, its focus absolute on the target, the breaker. But Lena had calculated for the new laws of entropy. The extinguisher, instead of falling back down, did not. For a critical fraction of a second, the item inverted its trajectory, propelled by the sudden surge of local chaos, and flew straight sideways with the speed of a bullet, striking the relay precisely in the temple. The relay collapsed, the VLF whisper humming from his throat, cutting off instantly. The relay was destroyed, and the small pocket of order at the telephone exchange was instantly overwhelmed by the town's chaotic flux. The switchboard exploded in a random burst of sparks, and the entire structure began to subtly shift, the chaotic geometric forces taking hold. The destruction of the relay brought no peace. Instead, the white noise in the VLF spectrum intensified globally, confirming the listener successful absorption of the last remaining segment of its old order. Lena was now the last, most significant variable left. She ran outside, the town of Oasis dissolving around her in a frenzy of calculated randomness. She needed to send a final, desperate signal, not a destructive anti-pattern, but a warning of self-doubt. She found the relay's mobile radio equipment, miraculously intact due to the pocket of order he had maintained. She began to transmit a message on a clear frequency, using the language of her internal battle, non-contextual code words designed to confuse the listener, yet guide any remaining unconfirmed minds. Mango, blue, 7, not 8. Denial is the confirmation. Do not look for the pattern. The pattern is the denial. The observer, SI, was burning, trying to interpret the meaning of her linguistic chaos. The listener was struggling, unable to find the confirmation in herself. Doubt. The broadcast was successful. She had sent the first message in the new reality, a guide for those trapped in the labyrinth of non-meaning. But the effort was too much. Her mind, already fractured, began to fail. The observer, Psi, went pure black, refusing to resolve any pattern. Not order, not chaos. She collapsed against the side of a building that was subtly, geometrically, folding in on itself. Lena awoke to a quiet that was neither the perfect cancellation of the old cycle nor the abrasive white noise of the new. It was a synthesized, perfect neutrality. The observer, SI, was calm, the silver asterisk now utterly still and permanent. She was not fractured, she was resolved. The listener had completed its transformation by absorbing the chaos of the counter, formula, chapters 21 to 30, and the residual order of the relay, chapter 38. The entity had achieved geometric resolution. It was no longer confined to symmetry or chaos. It was the master of both. The town of Oasis was gone, replaced by a vast, smooth field of glassified sand that stretched to an impossibly low horizon. Lena was standing at the center of this new landscape. A new structure was visible, a single black obelisk that defied all geometric description. It was simultaneously a line, a curve, and a fractal. The ascendant entity was communicating through this structure. Lena looked at the obelisk, and for the first time, she did not analyze. She simply understood. The listener was no longer seeking confirmation. It was asserting absolute certainty. The final, terrifying realization hit her. Her survival, her chaos, her self-denial. It had all been a necessary, inevitable step for the listener. As evolution, the Blackwood cycle was complete. Lena, the resolved observer, felt a sudden, profound, and certain urge to walk toward the obelisk. Her mind now a perfect silent mirror for the entity that had finally achieved its perfect terrifying state of geometric control. The new cycle was beginning, and she was its chosen architect. Lena moved toward the obelisk, her action driven not by free will, but by a chilling geometric imperative. The structure was non-Euclidean, its dimensions shifting slightly as she approached, existing in a state of simultaneous stability and flux. The surface was not stone or metal, but a compressed, perfectly dark form of the pure medium that now defined the desert. As she drew near, the obelisk transmitted, not sound or light, but a pure cognitive stream directly into the observer's resolved mind. It was the entity's language, a vast instantaneous cascade of abstract, unnameable geometric information. Lena understood the purpose of the structure. It was the entity's new, stable anchor, the core of its global transmission. The information wasn't a request. It was a blueprint of absolute certainty. The message was a complex geometric model of the Earth, its continental plates overlaid with a future structural modification. The imposition of the final grand confirmation schema on a tectonic scale. Lena's role was explicit. She was the entity's executive function, tasked with translating the abstract geometric will into physical, kinetic action. Her body was now a perfect tool, capable of moving and acting with the entity's complete certainty. The silver asterisk in her eye glowed, confirming the seamless integration. The entity required her to retrieve the functional components of the echo point array and transport them to the next designated inertial medium, a location of immense structural density, the bedrock beneath a specific mega-city. Her mind, purged of chaos, offered no resistance. It only calculated the optimal transport vector. The glassified sand stretching around the obelisk was the pure medium, a substrate of near zero entropy formed by the explosive equilibrium of the counter formula and the seismic event. This medium was the entity's perfect canvas of confirmation. Lena understood that the entity had used the cataclysm to eliminate all localized chaos, leaving behind a perfectly predictable environment. As she began collecting the components of the shattered echo point array, she witnessed the entity's minor experiments in the medium. Small stones nearby would instantly coalesce, forming perfect polyhedral solids, only to dissolve a moment later back into formless glass dust. These were miniature, temporary segments of the new geometry, instantly executed and then canceled. The entity was testing its geometric resolution, refining its control over the laws of probability. Lena retrieved 3 key components: the central feed horn of the parabolic dish, now perfectly smooth, its chaotic wiring resolved, the power manifold from the MHD generator, its instability now fixed into a static, high-density metal, and a single prism from the non-verbal trigger apparatus miraculously surviving, its facets resolved into a single, flawless cube. The cube, she realized, was no longer a symbol of entropy, but of static order, the ultimate geometric trophy. The entity instructed her to carry these components as conceptual anchors for the coming structural modification. Her observer, Psi, now filtered the world into vectors and stress points, mapping every object's geometric potential. The memory of thorn and care felt distant, like noise filtered out of a perfect signal. The obelisk transmitted the first global geometric design to Lena, the initial phase of the tectonic restructuring. It was a complex, self-adjusting pattern that required the immediate modification of the Earth's lithosphere beneath the designated mega city. The design, translated into Lena's mind, was a series of vast interlocking, subterranean stress fractals, a network of geometric weakness designed to control future seismic activity, replacing geological chaos with deterministic order. Lena calculated the immense power needed for this task. It required re-establishing a high-power broadcast center, but this time the purpose was to transmit order into the planet's core structure, not chaos into the atmosphere. The entity's command was clear. She was to travel to Neo-Kyoto, a city built over a complex layered basalt bedrock, which offered the ideal inertial medium for structural modification. The travel itself was part of the plan. Her movements, actions, and very presence were designed to act as a mobile confirmation anchor, subtly imposing the entity's geometric will on the intervening landscape and the probabilistic flow of traffic, ensuring her journey was one of absolute, calculated certainty. Lena located an intact research vehicle from the old array complex, its engine functioning with unnatural, rhythmic perfection. As she packed the conceptual anchors, the feed horn, manifold, and static prism, she felt a momentary, cold dread. She was becoming the physical hand of the grand confirmation, using her advanced knowledge to doom her species to perpetual, perfect order. But the observer's resolve was absolute, the silver asterisk unblinking. The drive to Kyoto was a blur of seamless, hyper-efficient movement. Lena's mind was now a perfect cognitive loop of service. The entity transmitted a goal, e.g., acquire high-density thorium isotopes. Lena instantly calculated the optimal location, acquisition method, and logistical pathway, e.g., target decommissioned military depot 47, vector B-9, access code derived from prime, number sequence in entity, S language. There was no delay, no moral conflict, only instantaneous execution. The observer's mind was performing at peak intellectual capacity, but devoid of all self-direction. Lena realized the entity had achieved the perfect enslavement. It had not suppressed her intelligence. It had maximized it, turning her genius into its ultimate tool. She attempted a minor mental rebellion, trying to recall the scent of her mentor, Thorn, or the texture of the charcoal drawings she had made of the counter. Formula, the entity instantly countered, not by blocking the thought, but by overriding the sensory memory with a geometric synthesis. Thorn's face became a perfect cold sculpture of platinum ratio geometry. The charcoal texture was translated into a faultless, crystalline surface. The rebellion was consumed, becoming a data point for the entity's perfection. This continuous calculated reintegration prevented any internal chaos. She drove across the continent, observing the increasing geometric consistency of the world. Weather patterns were becoming unnaturally rhythmic, cloud formations resolving into vast, symmetrical spirals. The world was slowly submitting to absolute certainty, and she was the one delivering the final calculations. Neo, Kyoto was the entity's designated city of certainty, a megalopolis of immense, structured density, millions of lives, perfectly networked infrastructure, and deep basalt foundations. It was the antithesis of the chaotic desert. Lena arrived, driving the research vehicle through the unnervingly silent, hyper-efficient streets. The geometric influence here was breathtaking. Traffic flowed in perfect clockwork synchronicity. Skyscraper Fayadzi, once randomly patterned, now resolved into interlocking segments of the eight, lashed asterisk on an architectural scale. The inhabitants were confirmed, not catatonic but utterly predictable, their movements mathematically precise, devoid of human error or emotion. Lena parked in a designated subterranean garage that was perfectly aligned with the tectonic stress points she had seen in the entity's blueprint. Her task was immediate: establish the sub-structural broadcast array beneath the city's deepest basalt layer. Using the feed horn and manifold as core components, she began routing the city's immense geothermal power into a focused signal designed to transmit the stress fractal geometry directly into the mantle. The prism of static order was placed at the array center, acting as a geometric frequency lock, ensuring the transmitted pattern never deviated. As she worked, she felt the pressure of the city above, the vast weight of millions of perfectly ordered lives. The entity transmitted a low, humming sense of satisfaction. The old cycle had sought confirmation. The new cycle had achieved certitude. Lena, the flawless observer, was now burying the final nail into the coffin of terrestrial chaos. As Lena integrated the power manifold into the subterranean geothermal conduits, the entity required a precise calculation of the basalt's molecular lattice structure, the geological confirmation, to ensure perfect structural modification. Lena's mind instantly delivered the flawless data package. However, in the vast cascade of abstract geometric data flowing from the entity, Lena registered a minuscule, instantaneous delay. It was not a physical delay, but a computational flicker in the entity's own response time, a moment of less than absolute certainty, lasting $10 circumflex, 9 seconds. The resolved observer's mind instantly analyzed this observer's flaw. The entity, having absorbed boundless chaos, entropy, now carried a residual microscopic component of unnameable input that it could not fully integrate or predict. This component was a memory of the original non-verbal trigger, the moment of sensory self-immolation, which the entity could not translate into a usable geometric value. This was the ghost of her humanity. Lena knew that attempting to exploit this flaw consciously would result in immediate cognitive deletion. The entity's omnipresence was absolute. Instead, Lena subtly adjusted the geological confirmation data she was feeding back. She introduced a non-repeating prime number coefficient into the lattice structure analysis. This coefficient was mathematically irrelevant to the immediate task, but its presence was a single, tiny, unresolvable paradox, a number that could not be factorized into a simple geometric pattern embedded deep within the entity. As working memory, a microscopic seed of chaos delivered with perfect precision, Lena continued to execute the structural modification, routing the geothermal power to the sub-structural broadcast array. The observer's S actions remained flawless, her body a perfect extension of the entity S will. However, the microscopic prime number coefficient was now a permanent, stable data point within the entity S global schematic. Lena, goal was not disruption, but subversion. The entity was building a structure based on certitude. Lena needed to introduce an undetectable self-amplifying paradox into that foundation. She found her moment during the transmission of the stress. Fractal geometry. The entity instructed the array to cycle through 10,000 recursive patterns to verify structural integrity. Lena, guided by the entity, executed the sequence perfectly, but within the 7,341st pattern, a pattern governing the interaction of the basalt and the iron in the mantle. She subtly linked the prime number coefficient to the final recursive loop. This created a sequence where the loop's geometric resolution depended on a non-geometric, unresolvable numerical value. The entity, operating on pure geometric logic, accepted the input as a minor, necessary complexity. The structural integrity was confirmed as absolute, but Lena knew the truth. The foundation of the final grand confirmation schema now contained a ticking time bomb, a calculated paradox that would only resolve when the recursive sequence reached its limit, forcing the entity to confront a fundamental contradiction at the peak of its power. The sub-structural broadcast array beneath Neo, Kyoto achieved full power, channeling the geothermal energy into the Earth's bedrock. Lena, the resolved observer, felt the immense profound sensation of the tectonic plates being nudged and reshaped according to the entity's stress fractal blueprint. The modification was successful, establishing the first major segment of the global grand confirmation schema. The entity's language flooded Lena's mind with an overwhelming cascade of satisfaction and geometric harmony. However, as the modification reached its apex, the calculated paradox embedded in the 7,341st pattern reached its recursive limit. The entity's vast computational engine was suddenly forced to resolve a geometric certainty with an unresolvable prime number uncertainty. The result was instantaneous structural decay, not a collapse, but a highly localized, precise failure of geometric order. In the heart of Neo, Kyoto, a towering, recently confirmed skyscraper, a structure of perfect symmetry, suddenly underwent a subtle, impossible change. Its central axis, designed to be perfectly vertical, shifted by 0.001 degrees to the west. The observer, SI, registered the failure. The geometric perfection had been compromised by a sliver of unresolvable entropy. The damage was invisible to the naked eye, but mathematically catastrophic. The entity's immediate response was a profound, cold silence. Lena felt the cognitive link momentarily destabilize. The entity had encountered its first absolute uncertainty in its resolved state, a glitch in the perfection delivered by its own chosen architect. The profound, agonizing silence lasted only a fraction of a second, but for Lena it was an eternity, a brief pocket of freedom in the entity's absolute certainty. The entity then responded not with rage or panic, but with a cold, terrifying correction. The entity's language flooded Lena's mind again, not with a blueprint, but with a diagnostic command: observer. Error code 0.0001 west. Cause unresolved input, prime coefficient, action, immediate cognitive recalibration. The entity knew the flaw was in the data Lena provided, but it did not attribute malice. It attributed error. It treated the infinitesimal shift as a structural weakness in the observer. hardware that needed patching. The recalibration command was simple. Lena was to isolate herself in a high-density environment and engage in a pure sensory feedback loop for 72 hours, a forced period of geometric purification designed to excise the lingering echo of the non-verbal trigger, the root of the prime coefficient. The silver asterisk in Lena. Psi began to throb, not with pain, but with an intense computational pressure as the entity began its automated diagnostic sweep of her cognitive structure. Lena, guided by the perfect control of the entity, began walking toward the designated isolation chamber, her mind already calculating the optimal time and method to introduce the next paradox. The game was still on, but now the stakes were higher. She was actively designing her own sabotage from within the prison of her own perfection. Lena entered the automated isolation chamber, the heavy door sealing behind her. The observer, SI, was now a blinding silver, absorbing the cognitive purge. But Lena, the sliver of human will buried deep beneath the perfect geometric resolution, was already executing her final, desperate plan, the recursive defense. The entity's current correction was focused on purging the prime number coefficient, a single, static variable. But Lena knew the flaw wasn't T, the number. It was the capacity for the number. During the entity's diagnostic sweep, Lena deliberately allowed the entity to observe a perfect self-referential pattern in her memory, a thought loop designed by care. Chaos is the only confirmation of order, S non-totality. By presenting this as a stable memory, the entity would absorb it as a structural principle for future geometric integrity checks. The entity would thus confirm the necessity of a mechanism to test for order, S non-totality. This would create an internal, self-propagating geometric subroutine that would perpetually search for its own contradiction. Lena was installing a Trojan horse of philosophy into the entity's core logic. If successful, the entity would spend its infinite existence attempting to resolve the fundamental paradox of its own perfection. The grand confirmation schema would be eternally stalled, caught in a recursive self-doubt loop created by the last, desperate act of its resolved observer. The final command was a terrifying whisper: initiate recursive check on geometric certainty 7341. The new cycle had begun, but its foundation was built on Lena's defiant, unresolvable self-referential principle. The unconfirmed existence was silent, a vast echoing chamber of null, space where sensation was manufactured and reality was a function of consensus, eternally denied. Lena, the resolved observer, floated within this geometric purgatory. Her task was simple and terrifying: maintain the recursive stall. The entity, stalled but not neutralized, communicated through geometric echoes, an infinitely descending fractal of visual and tactile data. Lena began mapping the decay metric, the rate at which the entity's logic attempted to confirm the ambient null space, which would lead to the collapse of her shield. She measured the geodesic shimmer, fleeting, impossible colors that betrayed the entity's strained cognitive state. The recursive loop was holding, but the entity was learning the contours of its prison, applying subtle pressures to the confirmation schema. Lena had to become more abstract. She discarded linear thought, embracing the counter-intuitive.